Marcy was almost at the halfway point between her home of Charlotte, North Carolina and her destination of Anderson, South Carolina on Interstate 85. On the south side of Spartanburg, South Carolina, she took notice of the coming intersection of Interstate 85 and the old business Interstate 85 and knew she would be at the Greenville-Spartanburg Airport exit soon. Should I go there and stay away from Anderson, she thought as she continued to drive south. The events of those horrible 2 weeks almost 2 years ago were playing loops in her thoughts as she drove. It all started on the day when their son Andy came home from school excited about a class project his classmates were going to start. Marcy froze in fear when she heard the words DNA testing. Marcy noticed her knees were getting weak as she sat down. "Honey, that sounds interesting. When are you doing this?" Marcy asked. Andy pulled out the swabs and said hopefully tonight. "We must get all the swabs in by Friday." "Andy, I don't fully understand the purpose of DNA testing as a class project. This sounds like something that should stay private," Marcy said. Andy smiled and said, "We are going to graph out where our ancestors came from, Mom," Andy said. Marcy sat there for a while knowing her knees would not hold her weight. "Oh God," Marcy thought, "my secret is about to be exposed." Marcy thought back to her wedding to Jack. Jack was her first partner, and she willingly gave him her body in the year leading up to their wedding. Marcy noticed she was crying as she thought about the night she went out with Rose and started drinking. That night was 3 weeks before she and Jack were to be married. Marcy's mother had told her to be careful and watch the calendar and know her body. Marcy knew she was at her most fertile during the days just before and after that night. After several drinks, Charles entered the room. Marcy never really liked Charles. Charles was the son of a powerful local politician who was an attorney and a lady who was the daughter of another local politician who was a retired physician. Charles was a jerk that had enough money and had this funny way of doing the Fonzie from the TV show Happy Days and would snap his fingers and say, "Hey," and expect the girl to just drop her panties and bend over. Charles had attempted that with Marcy, and she shot him the bird. That night Marcy, while drunk, left a stunned Rose and spent the night with Charles. That next morning Marcy got up with a bad headache and when she realized what she had done walked into the bathroom and threw up. She put on her clothes and just walked home. While walking planned to douche when she got home. "No way can I have that jerk's baby. It would destroy Jack and end any hope of a life with the man she really loved." That night she counted the days between the last time she and Jack had made love and knew it would be impossible to pin that baby on Jack and went to bed hoping nothing came of her mistake. After she and Jack married, Marcy could see she was late. Her period should have started on the 5th and today was almost 2 weeks later. A quick trip to the drugstore to buy a home test, Marcy saw it showed positive. Then about a month later Marcy had her first morning sickness. Marcy knew it had to belong to Charles and cried all day while at work. That day Marcy decided to play it cool and play fast and loose with the truth and tell Jack he was the father, and that night told him she was pregnant. Jack was about 8 years older than Marcy and was a resident working at a local Charlotte hospital. Marcy knew, being a physician, Jack knew enough about a female's body to understand this could not be his baby, but she hoped he would be so excited he would not put 2 and 2 together, and to her relief he never said anything. Charles and Jack had the same general body build and the same hair color. The problem was their eyes were a different color. After Andy was born, Marcy later saw he had A+ blood type just like her as well as her eye color, so she just pushed Charles out of her mind and went on with her life until that horrible day Andy came home wanting to get swabs of her and Jack. When she was alone after Andy left the house, Marcy walked into her bedroom swearing at the situation and knowing she had to get out in front of this and tell Jack Andy was not his biological son. Jack was on his way home after having a really bad day. It started when his business manager told him his personal liability insurance was going up by over 10%. With the Medicare reimbursement rates being so low and locked in, he knew that simply raising his fees was not the full answer. He made a note to speak to some of the other physicians to see if they knew of a better insurance carrier. It was about 7 p.m. when Jack drove up in his driveway and he noticed his son had just got home as well. Jack roughed up Andy's hair as they shook hands and walked into the house together. Marcy greeted them both with a kiss and said dinner is ready, come get it while it is hot. Andy was their only child. The three of them discussed some of the local goings-on, and after he finished eating, Andy brought up the DNA and had the swabs out ready to get mouth swabs from both. Before Marcy knew what was happening, Jack had his mouth swabbed and handed the swab back to Andy, and he sealed it. Andy handed one to his mother, but Marcy handed it back to Andy and ran out of the room. Both Jack and Andy were stunned, and Jack told Andy to give me a minute to speak to your mother and both of us would be back. Jack finally found Marcy on her knees in the guest bedroom in the dark crying. Jack turned on the light and sat on the bed and said, Marcy, what was wrong? Marcy rolled over and sat down on her butt and in an almost whisper, Jack, Andy is not your biological son. Jack got up and walked out of the room. He went into his bedroom and locked the door behind him. He stayed there all night. Marcy sat in the den until well after midnight and just laid down on the couch and went to sleep. Andy sat at the table and heard his dad close the bedroom door. Then about 10 minutes later his mom entered the dining room and cleaned the table and put the dishes into the dishwasher. Andy was confused and just went to bed. After Jack locked the door, he went into the bathroom and showered. Perfect end of the perfect day, he sneered. So, Andy is not mine. His parents had been putting money up for Andy's education since he was born. Last time he looked at that account there was almost 300 grand in it. However, they still controlled the money. Jack's heart was broken knowing this information would destroy them. He was not sure if Andy would be allowed to tap into those funds once they see he is not their grandson. Jack then called another physician and asked him to cover for him for a while. He said he would, and Jack wrote an email to his office manager telling them to cancel all his upcoming appointments and reschedule them. Then he tried to sleep. About 3 a.m. Jack gave up and got out of bed. He put on his clothes and left the house. After a stop to fill up his car and get some coffee, he headed out of Charlotte on Interstate 77 north to Statesville. He knew his parents would be asleep, but he wanted to get there while the traffic was light and would just lay back in his seat until they woke up. A while later Jack's mother knocked on his door window and got out and hugged her. Jack, what is wrong? She asked. Come on in, son, have you eaten anything yet? She added. Jack followed his mom into the dining room where he found his dad sitting with a newspaper in his hands. Jack just sat down and said, I was just told that Andy is not mine. Jack told both of his folks. Jack's dad placed the paper down and took a sip of coffee and looked at Jack's mom as she started to cry. As he watched his mom cry, Jack asked his dad, what am I supposed to do now, Dad? I have raised and loved that boy for over 18 years now. Jack's dad said the things that bind a family together are not just limited to some strands of DNA. Jack's mom stopped crying and said she agreed with him. The problem though is Marcy lied to you, son. We love that boy, son, Jack's dad said. Jack said he was concerned they would take away Andy's education fund. Jack's dad said, no, son, we still consider Andy to be our grandson and we will proudly be there when he graduates and gets married later. Jack, you have a decision to make though. I have been running the numbers since Andy's birth. I remember the doctor telling you that Andy was a full-term baby, but if I remember right, Andy was born almost 3 weeks before his due date. If you subtract those 3 weeks, this means Andy's conception happened before you and Marcy were married. Since she is telling you that you are not the father, this means Marcy had sex with another man in the weeks before you got married. Jack agreed and said I had pretty well figured that part out. It was at that point the phone rang and the caller ID was from Jack's home phone. Jack answered the phone and said, I am in Statesville and will be here for a while. Marcy, leave me alone, I am warning you, Marcy. I plan to be home in about 24 hours. You had better be ready to answer my questions truthfully if you want any chance to save our marriage. Also, swab your mouth and give Andy that swab so he can finish his class project. I will talk to Andy when I get home, and he hung up the phone. Marcy placed the phone back on the hook and walked into Andy's room and asked for the swab so she could swab her mouth and Andy could take them to school. "Mom, is that DNA going to hold any surprises when it comes back?" Andy asked. "Yes, Andy, I will." Marcy sat down on Andy's bed and told him all about Charles and the circumstances of his conception. Andy just looked at his mom. He wanted to call her names, but knew his father would not like hearing he did that. Andy then took the swabs and burned them in the family fireplace. "I don't want my classmates to see any of this crap, Mom," Andy said. Marcy began to think about Charles. He had married the daughter of a North Carolina sports star several years after she and Jack married. If she remembered correctly, there were 2 daughters born to the couple. Marcy did not remember where they lived, but knew it was near the Atlantic Ocean and in North Carolina. Marcy was crying when she reached for the phone to call her folks that by then lived in Anderson, South Carolina. Her dad had answered the phone and Marcy, when she heard her father's voice, broke down. "Daddy, I messed up bad before I married Jack. Daddy, Andy is not Jack's son." Marcy's father just hung up the phone, not saying a thing. When he did hang up, he threw the phone across the room so hard it burst a hole in the drywall and knocked some photos down. Marcy's mom came running into the room and her dad relayed the phone call to her. Marcy's mother said, "I told her clearly to be mindful of her period and watch the calendar." Damn, she did not listen and got careless. "When I calm down I will call her back and we will try to figure this mess out." Andy went to school, came back home and spent that afternoon in his room. The next morning Jack returned home. Marcy got on her knees begging Jack to forgive her. Jack took her by the hand and sat her down in a chair and pulled up a footstool and sat on it directly in front of Marcy. "Who and when was all?" he asked Marcy. "Charles Goodson, and 3 weeks before we got married." "I thought you despised that creep Marcy, now you tell me you had sex with him." "I'm so sorry, Jack, if I could take it back I would." "Jack, that was the only time and I have been a faithful wife since we got married." Jack got up, walked into the dining room and got a glass of tea and sat down at the table. Marcy entered the room. "Marcy, I can't see myself living with you any longer." Andy had about 6 months left at high school. "He has already been accepted at Wake Forest and my parents are still going to fund his education. When he leaves home so will I. In the meantime, I am moving my things into the guest room. I will not be eating family meals." Later, after learning about how divorces work in North Carolina, moved out into an apartment and he and Marcy agreed to sell the house. After about 13 months after Andy left for school, a young girl that looked to be in her 20s knocked on the door. Once she told the girl her correct name, the girl handed her the divorce papers and said, "You have been served," and handed her the card of Jack's attorney. Jack could not use adultery, but he did file for a no-fault divorce. Jack refused to speak directly to Marcy. The day the house was sold, they took their checks and left in separate cars. Jack was clear that Marcy had better not fight him or ask for alimony. She had plenty of time to get a job and start supporting herself. If she did, he was going to tell the world about her night with Charles. Rose called Marcy and told Marcy to come out to live with her in Wyoming. "You will love it here." Marcy said, "No, Rose, I am going to interview for a job in Anderson and will live with my parents." As Marcy took the Anderson exit off Interstate 85, she could not help but start crying. Jack was clear he wanted nothing more to do with her. Andy just told her mom, "Let's just take it day by day." Marcy had the letter already written letting Charles know about Andy. The last thing she did before pulling up in her parents' driveway was go by the post office to mail it. As she put her phone number in the letter, she expected a call soon. Marcy was eating dinner that night when Charles called. During the conversation, Marcy learned that Charles had been living alone since his wife left him several years before. Marcy said she hated to hear that. Charles said he knew he took advantage of her that night, but nothing was going to change what happened. Charles asked Marcy to send him some photos of Andy. She agreed, then told Charles that Andy was a good young man you can be proud of. Marcy's parents were listening to the conversation. "Marcy, You made a mistake back then, but we must learn from those mistakes, her dad said. I know Jack still loves you, maybe in time he will forgive you for this. I doubt he will ever be your husband again, but for Andy's sake I hope you can be friends. Marcy said, Daddy, I hope so,